Good afternoon. My name is Turner Bitton. I'm the executive director here at Westview Media. Thank you for joining in our next event in our City Talk series. Today, we're joined by Katie Lewis, who is the Salt Lake City Attorney. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you very much. I'm so pleased to be with you today.
Yeah, we're very glad to have you. Just really quick, a couple of housekeeping items. Katie and I are the only ones here on our Zoom conversation. Most of you will be watching live on Facebook, and if you have questions or comments that come up, please leave them in the chat. We'll get to as many questions as we can today. But why don't we get started, Katie, by you telling us just a little bit about your background, and then because you're an attorney, I have to ask what law school you went to, or I'll get in trouble by all the other attorneys.
Well, first of all, I want to say I am very, very rarely interviewed. I tend to be on the internal service provider side of the city. So I'm just so thrilled to be here today to talk a little bit about what the city attorney's office does. And I'm originally from Colorado. I grew up in Colorado Springs and went to undergraduate with a degree in history at Colorado State University. And I came out to Utah to be a river guide because I'd really fallen in love with the deserts. And I did that for a few years and moved to Salt Lake City and worked here during the Olympics and realized that I wanted to do more with my brain. And so I went to the University of Utah Law School, thinking that I would be a water lawyer or an environmental lawyer based on my love of especially the deserts and the rivers. And I quickly realized that environmental law was not the right fit for me. And so I ended up going to a law firm here in town called Parsons, Bailey and Latimer, where I practiced transactional real estate. And during that time, I was lucky enough to also represent the town of Alta, which, if you're familiar with them, they're a very small municipality, but with some serious legal concerns, both land use, traffic congestion, the interplay between the Forest Service and the city. And so I really learned a lot about municipal law and realized that I loved it. I loved working for local government. So I had an opportunity about 8 years ago to come to the Salt Lake City. And I started here as a senior city attorney working for the Economic Development Department and the Community and Neighborhoods Department. And I also then transitioned to doing work for the Redevelopment Agency. And in January of 2020, when Mayor Mendenhall took office, she appointed me as the Salt Lake City attorney. And that's really been the great honor of my life to serve her administration and the city council in this moment in the city's history.
Well, thank you. And interestingly enough, you're the second person who we've interviewed that also worked at the town of Alta. Laura Briefer also worked there. So interesting how things come full circle.
Yes, absolutely.
Why don't you give us just a little bit of a view of what the Salt Lake City Attorney's Office does?
Absolutely. So we're a pretty small legal department for a capital city. You know, if you think about Denver or even Boise, they can have 45, even 100 lawyers, and we only have 16. And then we have an administrative staff and paralegals, and we do all of the civil legal work for the city. So we don't do any of the criminal prosecutions. That's handled by the county district attorney. But we do everything else, everything from the airport expansion, construction contracts, litigation, legislative work, the priorities of our elected officials, which of course include affordable housing, homelessness, real estate, parks and recreation, everything that you read about in the newspaper and everything that you think about that the city does, your water and sewer service. We represent the city on all of that. So it's not just the courtroom, it's actually a lot of the legal advice leading up to transactions and initiatives that the city prioritizes. So it's really every day is different.
I can imagine. And just to give folks a little bit of background, can you just explain the difference between a civil case and a criminal case and where that line is drawn?
Absolutely. So a criminal case is exactly what you would think of. Someone is charged with a crime by the state and prosecuted for that crime and ultimately could serve jail time. A civil case is all the legal stuff that's not criminal is sort of the layman's way of saying it. But in the courtroom, it's a lawsuit that doesn't result in jail time. It's a lawsuit that would result in either someone stopping what they're doing or paying damages or restoring something that someone has done in some way, but it does not have to do with a crime. So it's all the other courtroom stuff that happens that's not a crime.
Thank you. I just wanted to provide that as a little bit of background information.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned this a little bit in your introduction, that you work with a variety, I would say probably all departments within the city. How do you work with the city? And I think folks tend to think of the mayor's office and the council as somewhat separate, but you're the attorney for everyone. So how does that work out?
That's right. So first of all, our lawyers are all, except for we have 4 litigators who do all of the courtroom work that I was just telling you about. All of the other lawyers are chief counsel for our various departments. So we have a police department lawyer, an HR lawyer, a finance department lawyer, and they're on a day-to-day advising those departments on their legal issues, everything from contracts to ethics issues to ordinances. And so that's their day-to-day. I, as the city attorney, represent, most of my time is spent advising the elected officials and their staff on the priorities that the mayor and the city council has. And Salt Lake City is an interesting city, and there are only a handful of them in Utah that are a separation of powers form of government, which it's exactly the way you think of the federal government, where you've got an administrative branch and a legislative branch with co-equal powers. And because we represent the entity as the city attorney, we represent both branches as to their co-equal powers. So we spend some time working with them and helping them understand what is administrative and what is legislative, and then helping them achieve their priorities.
Thank you. So the process for becoming Salt Lake City attorney, are you an appointed position, appointed by the mayor and confirmed by the council?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Thank you. So as we kind of think about your office, and I'm gonna refer to it as the city attorney office, but as we think about the city attorney's office, what do you think the most important takeaway for viewers is about your department?
Well, I think there are 2, and one of them is what we do, and then the other one is who we are. So what we do, sometimes people think that the city attorney's office represents the citizens of Salt Lake. So we often get phone calls about a pothole or a neighbor dispute or something that a citizen would like us to represent them on. And we have to explain to them that while we can provide recommendations or resources for those legal questions, we represent the city as an entity. And even though they live in the city and their issues might be tangentially related to the city, we don't represent them personally. So I think that's one thing that people might not know about the city attorney's office. And then, the takeaway that I would like viewers to know about the people in the city attorney's office is what a professional and skilled group of public servants we are. So we're all in this line of work because of our commitment to the community. And many of us are Salt Lake City residents, and we care deeply about the city. So I think, sometimes people think of lawyers as not very pleasant to be around or, just in it for the fight. And I would say just the opposite about the team of lawyers that we have. We're a collegial and collaborative and professional group that are really trying to help the city achieve the goals that they have.
Thank you. We got an audience question. I just want to speak really quickly to that. Mark, we got your question. I'm going to get to it in just a minute when we get a little bit further down with our questions. My next one to kind of ask you about is what are the biggest projects or priorities that your office has right now in representing Salt Lake City?
Sure. So we work on the council and the mayor's priorities, and I'm sure that you've talked to some of the other department directors about what those are, but from our perspective, it's equity and homelessness and affordable housing, police reform, land use and zoning issues, economic development and redevelopment. But then, of course, that's all overlaid by the year that we've had. So this year, with the COVID-19 emergency, the windstorm, the earthquake, and the civil unrest, we've really been challenged to think creatively about how to help the department serve the citizens, get resources out quickly to the community, deal with the emergencies in a way that we've been, I think, faster and more nimble than you sometimes see the city attorney's office, because we had to be. So those are some of the priorities. I will say that our litigators, especially Samantha Slark, who represents the city in the Inland Port litigation, has been deeply involved in that. I'm guessing that some of your viewers would be interested to know that oral arguments are scheduled in front of the Utah Supreme Court on that on April 21st. So Samantha is finishing her brief that will be filed with the court and preparing for oral argument. And that's a big priority for us because of the long-ranging consequences about how a municipality interacts with state government and where those lines are. Those are very important questions that will be addressed in that litigation.
Thank you. And you kind of went into a little bit of depth about what the fundamental arguments are in that case, but just wondering if you could, and you don't have to go into depth necessarily, but if you could kind of just lay out what that case is fundamentally about.
Absolutely. And what I'm going to tell you today is all in the public record. All of the briefings are public up to this point. And really the question in the Inland Port litigation is whether the state usurped our municipal authority by creating the Inland Port Authority Board. And there's a constitutional provision called the Ripper Clause. And what it says in simple terms is that the state cannot create an unelected, unaccountable board that takes municipal money or power. And so in this case, the question is whether the Inland Port Authority, which has the right to take a percentage of the city's tax revenue and also has drawn a line around a portion of the city and has certain rights in that area of the city, the Northwest Quadrant, whether that board, which is not elected by Salt Lake City voters, whether that board's existence violates the Utah Constitution by taking core municipal authority.
Thank you. So just kind of assuming that, let's say Salt Lake City wins our lawsuit, what are you seeking in terms of the resolution of the lawsuit?
You know, we are seeking, we can't seek to undo the board because the board can exist. What we are seeking is that for them to no longer have those authorities that usurp our power. So there's land use authority and there is the taking of municipal money. So that board could exist in a different capacity, but not take those core municipal functions.
Okay, thank you. And I won't go into any further depth. Folks can follow. I'm sure it will be reported on quite broadly after this conversation. So to kind of get back, we did talk about the inland port. Are there any other priorities or projects on the west side that your organization is working on?
Absolutely. And again, I would say anything that you read in the newspaper, anything that you hear about that the city is working on the west side, my office is involved in it. So, you know, a few that I can think of right off the top of my head is any of the work that the RDA is doing in the west side, including the Fair Park, the 9 Line, economic development loans, the Fisher Mansion. Of course, I mentioned the Inland Port litigation, any of the various homelessness initiatives, affordable housing initiatives. Of course, the airport touches on the west side and some noise issues or issues like that. The Jordan River cleanup and ways to ensure, you know, safe parks, recreation opportunities. All of those initiatives that span across the entire scope of the city, our office is involved with if there's a legal issue, and frankly, usually there is.
Thank you. As people think about your organization and department and kind of where you're situated in the organizational chart, if you will, should you be viewed as an independent department making advice to the mayor, or do you work, for example, do you work for the mayor and for the city council, or are you a standalone department all on your own?
My office works for the mayor and for the city council. We are not an independent agency.
Okay, I just think it's helpful for folks to understand kind of how you're structured.
Absolutely.
So you kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but I'm wondering if you would share kind of your just general approach or philosophy to your day-to-day job.
Great, absolutely. So, and I mentioned this a little earlier, Turner. I think sometimes lawyers are considered impediments or just there to fight, or people who slow projects down. And I believe that, of course, our job as the city attorneys are to protect the city and analyze risk. But I also believe our job is to do that in a timely way, in a way that helps our elected officials and departments achieve their goals as quickly as possible. And that really was a critical element of this past year, where we just didn't have time to, slow roll initiatives. We had to be part of the team that was getting resources and creative solutions out to our community quickly. And I'm really proud of what the city attorneys contributed in this past year to all the various initiatives to help our community for the COVID-19 emergency and the windstorm and the earthquake. And one thing I'll also say about what I think is really important is I try to be a lawyer who is really inclusive in my language, in my communication style, and I try to have my lawyers on my team do the same, because I think sometimes lawyers can speak in an technical or an erudite fashion that it's not helpful to people. And so often when I'm speaking to my team of lawyers, I'll say, break it down to me in the simplest terms. And if I can't explain it back to you, then we need to do it again. And we often use charts and visual aids, because I just think our job is to help in the simplest way possible and not make things more complicated or more difficult.
Thank you. I'm going to ask my last prepared question, because it looks like we're going to have a few audience questions. Just wondering if you had a story of success or some inspiration that you've achieved in your work.
Absolutely. So I've touched on this a few times, but I'm just so inspired by what we were able to do this past year in the face of the local emergencies. And I'm really inspired by the integrity and the leadership of our local officials, our elected officials, because it's not always easy to make these types of decisions and deploy resources quickly. And I saw how challenging it was and how quickly they did that. And I'll also say, I'm very inspired by the members of the city's Racial Equity and Policing Commission. And I've had the opportunity to spend some time with them, of course, virtually, and watching their commitment to change and the commitment of time that they've put into the Racial Equity and Policing Commission has been a real honor. And especially the youth subcommittee, they just really inspire me and inspire, I think, the work that all of us are doing. So I'll just tell you that, and I hope it shows through, I love being part of local government. And I think local government really is where we can make fundamental change. And so it's been a hard year for all of us, but it's been a really inspiring year to be part of Salt Lake City government.
Thank you. I am going to give you a break, because I've asked you a bunch of questions in rapid succession, and just remind folks that are watching live that if you have questions, submit them in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can today. You mentioned the Commission on Racial Equity and Policing, and the first audience question we actually received is somewhat related. Mark asked, he asked what you think about qualified immunity. I think I'm going to change that a little bit and just say, can you explain what qualified immunity is and how it works at a city level?
Ooh, well, Mark, I want you to remember that I started as a transactional lawyer, and qualified immunity is a very technical aspect of litigation. But essentially, as I think about it, and the way we talk about it is a defense that an officer has in a use of force case that sometimes the city will use if if the facts support it. And I know that it probably sounds like I'm being a little vague, but it's a pretty technical area of the law, and I don't know that I want to go into that much detail about it, except for what I would like your listeners to know is we don't view it as, a free pass for bad actors, and we believe that it is a defense when there are certain times in use of force cases, but it is I think that there can sometimes be a misunderstanding that it's used by Salt Lake City frequently to get bad actors off the hook, and we don't view it in that light, to the extent that's helpful.
Thank you. Within your office, would it be your office, or would it be the senior advisor? I think you said senior advisor to the police department that would handle that kind of argument in a court case.
It would be my office. So as I said, we have 4 litigators, and they become jacks of all trades. So they learn every aspect of the law to prepare for every lawsuit that's filed against Salt Lake City. In those situations, the lawyer who is the chief counsel for the department sort of sits as second chair in those cases. So if it's a police case, we will have a litigator and the chief counsel for the police department working on that case and working through the facts.
Thank you. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit over to a different topic that's come up. Peter sent in a question about the stimulus, and I guess that our Attorney General has announced that he has some concerns about the way that the stimulus bill at the federal level was written. When, just taking this stimulus bill as an example, when legislation or policy is passed at a state level or a federal level, is your office in the process of reviewing all of those, or kind of how does your office interact with public policy?
That's a great question. So on the state level, this year in particular, and in previous years, although this was more involvement than I've ever had at the legislature. So on the state level, we are involved in conversations about how bills are drafted and how they will affect Salt Lake City. And we are working with our lobbying team and our elected officials to talk about what we should support and what we shouldn't support. So, and then of course, once the law is passed, our obligation is to inform our clients, whatever department they are, or our elected officials, of how that will impact Salt Lake City. On the federal level, my office does not have any involvement on the drafting or the negotiations of the language of the bill. But certainly if there are federal laws that impact Salt Lake City, like the recent stimulus bill, we will review those laws and advise our clients, the elected officials and the city departments, on how that would affect them.
Thank you. Now it's going to kind of turn into a little bit of a rapid fire, random potpourri of all kinds of different questions. We have an election coming up this year in Salt Lake City. And I have a 2-part question. Is your office involved in campaign finance? And then also, would your office be involved in the implementation of, say, ranked choice voting or any form of election law here in Salt Lake City?
Absolutely. So the city attorney's office has the lawyers and the administrative staff that I described. We also have a division that reports to me as the city attorney, which is the city recorder's office. And the city recorder's office manages all of the campaign finance disclosures and the entire process for campaign finance. And I work closely with the city recorder and her staff on those issues. And as they come up, election issues or campaign finance issues come up, lawyers in my office and I work with the recorder to navigate those questions. So that's the answer to question number 1. The answer to question number 2 is yes. Again, the recorder's office will be heavily involved in that question of ranked choice voting, whether Salt Lake City participates in it, and then what that looks like for Salt Lake City. And we're on the cusp of exploring that now. And as I understand it, we have I think a May deadline to determine whether or not we will engage in ranked choice voting. So that's a topic that's on our minds right now.
Thank you. The next question is, if someone were to file a complaint or have a concern about something and is there a process for triggering an investigation? And then what are kind of the parameters of those type of investigations in the city?
Sure. Salt Lake City has a fraud, waste, and abuse hotline. It's a website where somebody can file a complaint about anything related to the city government. So if they see city employees doing things that they think are illegal or wasteful or fraudulent, or they see something in the city they want to report, they can report to that hotline. Now, of course, there's other ways to report to the city if there's a zoning violation or things like that, but I'm thinking specifically about sort of legal bad acts. They could report through our fraud, waste, and abuse hotline, and those complaints come to me and a team of other people in the city. We look at those. There is an investigation team that reviews them and creates an investigation report on that complaint. If it's a complaint of a certain level, so let's say it's a complaint about a city department director or me or an elected official, then that will go to a third party investigator, because of course we don't want a conflict of interest of me or other department directors investigating our peers or elected officials. But there is a process for those types of complaints.
Thank you. So you mentioned that in that type of case, you'd seek outside support. Are there other cases where the city hires maybe an outside law firm or organization to assist with different legal matters?
You know, I have complete 100% faith in our legal team, but as I mentioned, we're a small shop. And so there are some specialty areas that we identify that we might need extra help. And one example that I use all the time is bond counsel. So the city takes out debt in the form of bonds, and it can be millions and millions of dollars. And that's a really specialized area of the law that we just have to hire outside counsel for. Typically, though, we've got a really strong team of diverse lawyers, and so most of our work we keep in-house except for those specialty questions.
Thank you. My next question, this one came from a person who I don't think has a real name. I think they're using a pseudonym online, but they're wondering if your office has any role in consumer protection.
You know, that's a great question. I have not been involved in any consumer protection work. I do know that one of my lawyers has become interested in it and has done some sort of tangential legal work to help some of our departments, but it's not something that we typically work on. I wish I had a better answer than that, but and if you want me to follow up, I'd be happy to, but it's typically not what we do. Also, because remember, we represent the city as an entity. And so some of those things might be us advising a city department that helps with consumer protection.
Thank you. My next question is, as the city council is preparing policy, and ordinances, is your office involved in that process, or is that separate?
Our office is very involved in that process, yes. So sometimes ordinances come from administrative departments, so a land use ordinance or a sustainability ordinance, and we will help those departments draft them. Sometimes those ordinances are initiated by the city council, and we will help also the city council draft those ordinances. So yes, that's sort of the bread and butter of a lot of the work that we do.
Thank you. I'm going to give you a break for just a second and remind folks that are watching, if you have a question that you've been sitting on or that you have at the front of mind, be sure to put it in the chat so that we can get to those. I'm running toward the end of my prepared questions and would love to have more audience questions if you are interested. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit and go to my actual final prepared question, which is there a question I should have asked you today that I haven't so far?
You know, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is what have I learned in this past year? Because it's been a challenging year. So I think if you asked me that question, my response would be how much I've learned about how resilient we are as a community and how important it is for me, but also for our leaders to trust their instincts and trust the people around them. And I guess the final thing that I've been thinking about a lot that I've learned this year under such challenging times is really the value of good leadership and leadership with integrity, because I think that can make all the difference when you are under such pressure as we have been in this past year. And I just feel extraordinarily lucky to have been surrounded by so many good leaders, both the department directors and the elected officials in Salt Lake City. Um, it would have been an even more difficult year without the team that we've got in place now.
Yeah, thank you. As you were talking, one of the things that came to my mind as a question is, was there anything, I'm sure that last year was filled with uncertainty, but was there one thing above all that kind of sticks out as something that you didn't anticipate having to deal with, but that your office ended up being involved in?
Well, I mean, all of COVID-19 was something that we didn't expect. But one thing from a real legal perspective is we had to learn very quickly what it meant to declare a local emergency and what powers the mayor could exercise under that local emergency. And I will just about guarantee you that never in the history of Salt Lake City have we had at one point 4 separate local emergencies. So that that is something that I never thought that I would experience in my career, and having to really become an expert on that subject. And now I feel like you could ask me anything about local emergencies, and I could probably tell you the scope of those powers and what it means to declare one.
Well, thank you. I can't imagine how interesting the last year has been, just in the amount of things that you've had to tackle all at once. I just want to say thank you to you. We don't have any more audience questions, so I just want to say thank you to you for your time today, and thank you for your public service. And do you have any last kind of thoughts or parting wisdom?
Just to express my gratitude to you and to your viewers, and to what you're doing to try to help people get to know the leaders in the city. I really, I'm very grateful for this opportunity and the opportunity to speak to all of you today. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And again, thank you. And please pass our gratitude on to your entire team. I really appreciate your time today, and you take care. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.